Greetings and salutations, fellow book readers. This is Mark, and the book I'll review today is A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. Before we continue, this is personalized limited edition of A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man with leather cover designed and made by me. At the end of the video, I will tell you a couple of ways of how you can get one for yourself if you are interested. Now let's get back to the review. A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man is a novel, largely autobiographical, written by the Irish writer James Joyce and published in 1916. It is considered his first novel, but actually it is a condensed and rewritten autobiography begun a decade earlier and quickly abandoned. Joyce was a great writer with a large and healthy ego. He has begun his autobiography in his early 20s, probably already envisioning that others would be interested in his life. But then maybe came to conclusion it might be a bit early for this kind of work. Joyce is regarded as one of the greatest 20th century writers, best known for his mega novel Ulysses, which is maybe not rewriting, but somewhat of an adaptation of Homer's classic into the early 20th century world and modern literary style. Joyce, as most artists, was somewhat of a paradox. He was born in Ireland and comes across as a proud Irishman in favor of independence from the British rule, but he never exchanged his British passport for the Irish, even though Ireland was an independent nation for the last 20 years of his life. Most of his works are about Ireland and the Irish, but he seemed to have problems with the church, doubts about the Irish nationalism, and identified more as a European. He spent almost all his adult life on the continent, Trieste at the time it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, also Zurich, and 20 years in Paris. In Paris, he was part of the Lost Generation and interacted with many other famous writers, his contemporaries such as Hemingway, T.S. Eliot, and Ford Madox Ford. Perhaps his choice of living outside of Ireland was motivated by a need to put some distance between himself, his home, and his identity, to have a bit of an outside view, to be able to write unhampered about Ireland. Joyce's literature was ahead of its times, complex, heavily depended on stream of consciousness, and difficult to grasp for many readers. And because of it, he encountered many difficulties in having his works published, with many rejections. What is A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man about? It is a coming-of-age novel, thickly based on the writer's own life, autobiography employing alter ego. It is a portrayal of the school years and its impact on the formation of the Joyce's character. Welcome, O life, I go to encounter for the millionth time the reality of experience, and to forge in the smithy of my soul the uncreated consciousness of my race. In general, it is about the manipulation of young, unformed, and impressionable being, and how the seemingly unimportant events have crucial impact on the trajectory of our adult lives. A bit of the plot. The events take place at the end of the 19th century in Ireland and portray the early years of Stephen Dedalus. Dedalus, like Joyce himself, is the oldest child in a large Catholic family with financially incompetent and a heavy drinker father, devoted Catholic mother, and a tutor who is somewhat of a Catholic fanatic. The narration begins with Dedalus as a young child living with his family in a carefree and childish world. Once upon a time, and a very good time it was, there was a moo cow coming down along the road, and this moo cow that was coming down along the road met a nicest little boy named Baby Taku. And then began the years spent in the boarding school when the boy is adjusting to being away from his family and having to deal with abusive teachers and bullying students. After some time, Daedalus is forced to leave the school because his father is not able to pay the tuition, and he spends time living in the country with his family. Later, the family moves to Dublin, where his father is able to get him back into a private Catholic school, and he also meets his first love. As Daedalus matures, he starts to gain some intellectual confidence and also becomes somewhat obsessed with sex, which leads to experiences with prostitutes, followed by confessions and subsequent repentance, influenced by the priest's description of hell. Daedalus is so impacted by the vision of eternal damnation, he considers priesthood as a future lifestyle. But as he matures, the fear of the godly punishment subsides, and he starts to see life from a more practical perspective and decides to enjoy it. In the last part, Daedalus is attending university and becoming more philosophical, which is a viable substitute for religion, and further he starts to see Ireland as a bit small for his ambitions and decides to pursue his dreams elsewhere. And that's the basic plot. What are my thoughts about a portrait of the artist as a young man? The book is beautifully written, and it is a self-insight into the formation of James Joyce. The prose is revealing and descriptive, but also somewhat vague and indirect, so it requires focus and attention when reading it. To live, to err, to fall, to triumph, to recreate life out of life. A wild angel appeared to him, the angel of mortal youth and beauty, an envoy from the fair courts of life, to throw open before him, in an instant of ecstasy, the gates of all the ways of error and glory. On and on and on and on. Daedalus is sent to boarding school at a very young age, 6, and this separation from his family, especially from his mother, is somewhat of a traumatic event, and it makes him withdraw inside, teaches him to depend on himself and embrace loneliness. By his monstrous way of life, he seemed to have put himself beyond the limits of reality. Nothing moved him or spoke to him from the real world unless he heard it in an echo of the infatuated cries within him. He becomes sick and has to endure it without his parents, and wonders if he will die before they arrive. And this leads him to imagine his funeral service, and all these early events, traumas, are responsible for the creation of the latter, adult Daedalus or Joyce. When Daedalus is sick, he hears a priest mention the death of Charles Parnell, who was a popular Irish political activist in favor of Irish Home Rule, antecedent to the independence. Joyce himself wrote a seemingly unflattering poem about Parnell's death when he was 9 years old, and his father, who saw Parnell as a traitor, gave it to his friends. In the book, the death of Parnell sparks the reflections and opinions about Irish nationalism, and this can't be separated from the Catholic Church, which is an important and even unifying part of the Irish identity. We are an unfortunate, priest-ridden race, and always were and always will be till the end of the chapter. This is very similar to the situation in my own country, Poland, where the national identity has also been connected to the Catholic Church, and it was an important element in our own struggles for independence. It serves to differentiate us from the Protestant Germans and Orthodox Russians. Daedalus' education comes mostly from priests, and since he is a young child and because of it impressionable, it defines his early years. He considers the day of his first communion to be not only his, but the happiest day in any man's life. The day of your first communion was the happiest day of your life, and once a lot of generals had asked Napoleon what was the happiest day of his life. They thought he would say the day he won some great battle or the day he was made an emperor. But he said, "Gentlemen, the happiest day of my life was the day on which I made my first Holy Communion." So, after the initial influence of his parents and tutor Dante, the priests are responsible for the young Daedalus' early view of the world, which is somewhat continuation of the Dante's extreme Catholic beliefs. Their education is founded on corporal punishment and fear of God, and it is effective until the chaos of puberty shows up and he, Daedalus, begins to have adolescent experiences, starts to think on his own, and test the real powers, the limits of religion. And as the result, he starts to draw more independent conclusions about life. In a way, Daedalus is a normal, developing teenager, sinning in thoughts and acts while learning, and fantasizing and exploring his and others' bodies, including prostitutes. He moaned to himself like some baffled, prowling beast. He wanted to sin with another of his kind, to force another being to sin with him and to exult with her in sin. He felt some dark presence moving irresistibly upon him from the darkness, a presence subtle and murmurous as a flood filling him wholly with itself. But the religion doesn't give up easily, and Daedalus goes through a temporary moral awakening sparked by a priest's sermon, which is pretty long, detailed, and one of the most graphic literary descriptions of what happens to the sinners in the afterlife. There's the separation from the loved ones, the stench unlike anything on earth, the pitch darkness that is not affected by fire, and the eternal fire which never stops burning the sinner. Our earthly fire destroys at the same time as it burns, so the more intense it is, the shorter is its duration. But the fire of hell has this property that it preserves that which it burns, and though it rages with incredible intensity, it rages forever. The description is so vivid that it causes psychological, emotional, and even physical suffering in the young Daedalus, and he quickly runs to the confession, admits to all his wrongdoings, repents, and makes an effort to amend his sinful ways, at least temporarily, until he matures a bit more mentally, learns to use logic, and is able to see life as a more rational event. For example, when his father takes him to Cork, his birthplace, and talks about people he knew there, Daedalus realizes they don't really have any effect on him because they are dead. So slowly he is losing his interest in religion and instead starts to focus on things that relate more directly to his life. He becomes more curious about philosophy, discussing Aristotle's ideas, and literature, who the great writers were. As Daedalus gets older, he also starts to question the Irish identity and what does it mean, especially in relation to himself and the limitation it places on his life. "This race and this country and this life produce me," he said. "I should express myself as I am." "Try to be one of us," repeated Davin. "In heart you are an Irishman, but your pride is too powerful." "My ancestors threw off their language and took another," Stephen said. "They allowed a handful of foreigners to subject them. Do you fancy I am going to pay in my own life and person debts they made? What for?" There seems to be a need in young Daedalus to free himself from the past, not so much his own, but the legacy of his family and subsequently his country, to rebel against the sins of his ancestors, to nullify any responsibility for it, maybe so he can become a free thinker and have an unhampered view of the world, and as the consequence write in an unobstructed way. And this goes back to Joyce living most of his adult life abroad, somewhat cut from his roots, to have a new or different view of his past, more conducive to his individual identity. The novel also gives a bit of the usual adolescent drama every teenager seems to go through, first love and losing virginity, which here don't involve the same two people. It shows the effect those events have on young Deadless, and this all relayed in Joyce's poetic and sophisticated prose. With a sudden movement, he bowed his head and joined her lips to his, and he read the meaning of her movements in her frank, uplifted eyes. It was too much for him. He closed his eyes, surrendering himself to her, body and mind, conscious of nothing in the world but the dark pressure of her softly parting lips. They pressed upon his brain as upon his lips, and thought they were the vehicle of a vague speech, and between them he felt an unknown and timid pressure, darker than the swoon of sin, softer than sound or odor. There is further discussion of love, self-doubts, if the intellectual Deadless have ever loved anyone, and using love to debate God's power, question whether everybody is capable of love, and if even it is necessary, citing the examples of unconditional mother's love and love for one's mother, and mentioning its obvious absence in some exemplary historic figures. A very important and influential element in Deadless' life is Catholicism, which contains confession. Me as a child, growing in communist but also very Catholic Poland, I was basically forced to go to confession once a month, probably so the sins wouldn't accumulate and I wouldn't lose track of them, since consciously I couldn't imagine hiding any of them from the priest, not out of fear of the priest, but rather trying to avoid the divine punishment. Well, Deadless manages to skip his duty for almost a year, even though he's sinning at the average adolescent boy's level, but eventually the circumstances and his consciousness manage to drag him to confession, and after it he feels so cleaned and relieved for being absolved that it seems the most perfect moment to die. I think the importance of confession can only be fully appreciated by practicing Catholics. It serves to reflect on one's wrongdoings, some superficial but other important, and it leads to the effort to amend one's ways, to correct the course. The effect for the believer are probably similar to what a non-believer gets from talking to his psychologist. To sum it up, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man is a beautifully written novel, complex and vague, and it might be seen as preparatory work for Ulysses. The writing style, with its use of stream of consciousness, was polished to be perfectly employed in the latter novel. It probably also served for Joyce to remember and reflect on his childhood and early years, to see where he came from and how it contributed to the forming of his adult self. The prose progressively becomes more complex and difficult to understand, probably to reflect Deadless's own character becoming more sophisticated and multiplex, but at the same time the writing becomes more beautiful and poetic. The book might be a good novel to read before James Joyce's magnum opus Ulysses. It lays a bit of foundation for his later masterpiece. There is a very good adaptation of the text to film. It was produced in the 70s and it seems to have been made in Ireland. I think the film does a good job portraying young Joyce. You probably can find it on YouTube. Okay, let's talk about the physical book. The book I am holding is a soft cover, which I transform into hardcover leather-bound edition. To make the cover, I use grade A naturally tan hide I buy from a tannery in North Spain. It is the same leather Louis Vuitton uses to make his bags, so it is top quality. I do all the processing of leather myself. First I designed the cover, and what I did here, I used this lathe 19th or early 20th century painting of a young lad in Catholic school, probably preparing for exams in the library. This is the back with the blurb, and inside front cover I printed a quote from the book. If you want to see more detailed video where I explain how I transform paperback into leather-bound hardcover, click on the link in the description. I will make maximum of 100 editions of each title. Each one will be numbered and initialed, and the numbers will go in chronological order from 2 up, since number 1 stays with me. The price will be around $100, so if you would like me to make one for you, you can click below on my email and send me a message. I do not guarantee I will do it, since it will depend on the time I have available, access to leather, and if I can get my hands on the copy of the book. Now, if you're not willing to spend the $100 but you still want the book, what you can do is click below on the PayPal link and donate $3 or more to my channel, and for every 100 donations I will make a lottery and draw one name, and the winner will receive the book. So if you are cheap but feel lucky, this might be the way to do it. Also, your donations give me the extra motivation to make the book reviews, and I appreciate them very much, so thank you in advance. One more thing, when you make your donation, remember to include the title of the book you would like to win. The book itself is beautiful. Visually it has a very nice texture, it smells great, and the more you handle it, the more beautiful it will become. And it makes a great gift for yourself or somebody who appreciates books. So if you want one, don't snooze or you might lose. Well, that's it, so let's end it here, and until next time, keep your ear close to the ground and read a book. Adios.